She was unaware that she was entering her own torment when the HOA president attempted to evict him. Malik Patterson had always aspired to own property in a tranquil, affluent neighborhood. He eventually achieved his goal after years of diligent effort. The house, a two-story brick residence in Brentwood Estates, Tennessee, was situated on a meticulously maintained lot that featured a wraparound veranda and a generously proportioned backyard. It was precisely as he had imagined, a serene, sophisticated, and ideal location for a permanent residence. However, there was an unsettling sensation that persisted from the very first day. Malik observed the eyes as they peered from behind curtains, watched from porches, and lingered a second too long as neighbors strolled their dogs. Moving boxes still lined the driveway. No one approached. There will be no cordial introductions. There is no welcome to the neighborhood. There is only silence. Initially, he dismissed it. It is possible that individuals in this area simply maintained their privacy. Perhaps they would become more amiable as time progressed. The subsequent morning was the first indication that the event would not transpire. Malik had scarcely completed the process of brewing his coffee when he heard a sudden knock on the door. He opened it to discover a woman in her mid-60s standing on his veranda. She was attired in a beige blouse that was meticulously pressed, pearl earrings, and a brooch that was affixed to her cardigan with the HOA emblem. Her expression was neutral, and her posture was rigid. However, there was an oddity in her irises that Malik was unable to identify. "Good morning," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm Barbara Whitman, president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association." Malik extended his hand and smiled with a courteous demeanor. "Nice to meet you." She interrupted, glancing past him into the home, "I am aware of your identity. I wanted to go over a few things." She presented him with a substantial collection of printed documents, which were stapled in the corner. These documents were the guidelines for the Homeowners Association. Malik perused the pages, noting the customary regulations, including the need for lawn maintenance, the limitations on exterior paint, and the approved mailbox designs. Typical fare. But Barbara then cleared her throat. "We strive to uphold a certain standard here," she stated, her eyes resting on the moving truck that was still located in the driveway. "I assume you'll have that removed by this evening?" Malik's eyebrow was elevated. "It'll be gone once I'm done unpacking." Barbara nodded, but it was not a sign of satisfaction. Rather, it appeared that she was recording information in her mind. She replied, "That is satisfactory. And just so you're aware, the HOA requires that trash bins be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." Malik responded in a uniform manner, "I did not dispose of them. The previous owners must have." Barbara's lips were pursed. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." She abruptly turned and departed. Malik slowly exhaled as he closed the door. Possibly, she was simply being overly particular. Numerous homeowners association presidents were. He was determined not to allow a strict neighbor to undermine his new beginning. However, the subsequent days demonstrated that Barbara was not merely particular. She was observing. He received a notification in his letterbox regarding an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway, which was his personal vehicle. His grass had grown an inch, possibly two, and he received a second notice regarding inadequate lawn maintenance. Subsequently, a HOA violation letter was received regarding a porch light that was overly bright, despite the fact that it was the same fixture that had been used by the previous proprietor. Malik had amassed an orderly stack of documents from Barbara by the conclusion of the week. He had not communicated with her since their initial encounter. However, it was irrelevant, she had established herself. Nevertheless, he maintained his composure. It is possible that she behaved in this manner with all individuals. Maybe he simply needed to adhere to the regulations, and she would back off. However, Malik's optimism was quickly dashed when he encountered a group of residents conversing on a nearby driveway during his evening stroll. Upon his appearance, they quieted down. But no one else acknowledged his presence, only one woman offered a constrained smile. Barbara stood in the center, arms crossed, murmuring to the others. Malik was aware that this was not a discussion about HOA regulations without hearing the words. It was about him. However, Barbara was in for a rude awakening if she believed she could coerce him into departing. The letters continued to arrive. Malik received a new notice in his mailbox each morning, which was perfectly folded and sealed with the Brentwood Estates HOA stamp. Initially, he discarded them in a kitchen drawer, briefly perusing them to verify his suspicions that Barbara Whitman was determined to ruin his life. However, Malik had reached his limit when he received the fifth missive in a mere 2 weeks. This time, the subject was his garbage cans. Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics, according to the correspondence. Malik gazed at the paper, feelings of irritation rising beneath his epidermis. After work, he had collected his receptacles in the same manner as his neighbors. However, it appears that this was insufficient. He resolved to conduct a brief experiment out of curiosity. He rose early the following morning and proceeded to stroll leisurely through the neighborhood. By 9 a.m., dozens of garbage bins were still arranged along the curbs, as I was paying close attention to the houses. Lids were propped open with overflowing bags, and some were not even entirely closed. There was not a single violation notice on any of them, only his. Malik took a few photographs and sent an email to the HOA board, politely inquiring as to why his receptacles were a problem while those of others were disregarded. There was no response. However, Barbara returned to his doorstep 2 days later. This time, she refrained from knocking, rather, she remained stationary, arms crossed, and holding a clipboard. The door was opened by Malik, who then rested against the frame. "Something I can help you with?" Barbara did not respond immediately. She gazed over his shoulder, her eyes examining the interior of his residence as if she were conducting an inventory. She then presented a form. "This is a formal request for you to submit proof of home ownership," said the representative. "We've had complaints." Malik's abdomen contracted. "Complaints?" Barbara continued, her voice syrupy but pointed. "Neighbors have expressed concerns. They've noticed unusual activity, different cars coming and going, furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some are worried you may be renting this property in violation of HOA regulations." Malik's laughter was brief and devoid of amusement. "You're kidding." Barbara maintained her composure. He forced himself to remain composed by inhaling deeply. "First off, I own this house. Second, I've lived here less than a month. I'm still moving in, that's why there have been deliveries. And as for the cars, those are friends and family visiting." Barbara's fingertips tightened around her clipboard as she pressed her lips together. "Well, we have policies to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need to verify your deed." Malik was fully aware of the nature of this. She did not request proof of property ownership from any other neighbors, only him. Nevertheless, he maintained his voice at a moderate volume. "You can pull the records yourself. It's public information." Barbara's pupils briefly contracted, but she promptly recovered, regaining her composure. "I'd prefer if you submitted it directly." Malik inclined his head. "And if I don't?" Barbara's lips curled into a smile that was intended to be inviting, but there was no warmth behind it. "Then I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter with the HOA board." Malik slowly exhaled, suppressing the words that were on the tip of his tongue. She desired for him to respond by becoming enraged, raising his voice, or providing her with an excuse to make him the issue. Consequently, he simply grinned. He stated, "I will contemplate it," and subsequently shut the door before she could utter another word. Barbara was not fond of that. Malik observed her once more that evening while he was enjoying a beer on his veranda. She was standing at the end of his driveway, conversing with a man dressed in khakis and a polo shirt. She spoke in a low voice as she pointed toward Malik's residence. The man nodded and began to write something on a notepad. Malik was relieved of the necessity to speculate regarding the circumstances. Barbara was no longer merely attempting to intimidate him, she was actively seeking a method to eliminate him. However, she was about to receive a harsh lesson if she believed she could force him out. Malik received an email from the Homeowners Association the following morning. Subject: Notice of violation. His veranda furniture was the subject. His outdoor seating arrangement, which consisted of 2 wicker chairs and a small glass table, did not meet the aesthetic standards established in the HOA guidelines, as indicated by the email. A rule that is not entirely clear. One that was evidently not being enforced on anyone else. Malik slowly exhaled as he reclined in his chair. He had traversed this neighborhood on numerous occasions and was aware that at least a dozen residences had the same configuration, some even featured antiquated plastic chairs that appeared to have been left outside since the early 2000s. Nevertheless, his actions were the root of the issue. He disregarded the notification. An additional email was received the following day. Subject: Lawn maintenance violation, second notice. Malik expressed dissatisfaction. His lawn was recently mowed, edged, and watered. He had dedicated the entire afternoon to pruning the hedges, ensuring that they were immaculate. However, there it was, a formal complaint that indicated his grass was slightly overgrown and indicated that penalties could be imposed if the issue was not resolved. Malik was acutely aware of the circumstances. Barbara was attempting to overwhelm him with complaints, building up trivial infractions until she had the necessary leverage to escalate the situation. Consequently, he resolved to engage in her game. He took a leisurely stroll through the neighborhood that evening, documenting each actual violation he observed, including overgrown yards, broken shutters, faded house numbers, and garbage bins that were still positioned by the curb from the previous morning. Subsequently, he submitted his own complaints, each of which was reinforced by time-stamped photographs. Barbara returned in less than 24 hours. She was not alone this time. She stood at the border of Malik's driveway with another HOA board member, an elderly man with salt and pepper hair and a clipboard in his hand. Malik identified him from the HOA website. Stephen Reynolds, Vice President. Barbara's expression was more tense than usual, and the forced politeness barely concealed her irritation. She addressed him as Mr. Patterson, her voice becoming increasingly fragile. "We received your list of complaints." Malik crossed his arms and nodded. "Good. Then you know I'm not the only one being held to a ridiculous standard." Stephen cleared his throat and glanced at Barbara before speaking. "We appreciate your concerns, but the HOA board determines which issues require action. Not every minor infraction warrants a formal notice," Malik sneered. "So mine do, but everyone else's don't?" Barbara declined to respond. Conversely, she presented him with a printed form. "This is your final warning before fines are issued. Your porch furniture needs to be replaced, and your lawn must remain at the regulated length at all times." Malik gazed at the paper for a moment before gradually turning his attention to Barbara. He was not naive. This was not about furniture or vegetation. This was intended to create a sense of alienation in him. He forced a languid smile as he took a deep breath. "You know, Barbara, I've read the HOA bylaws from top to bottom. Nowhere does it say a homeowner needs to replace furniture that's in perfect condition." Barbara's body tensed. "It's a matter of neighborhood uniformity." Malik's eyebrow was elevated. "So you enforce rules that don't exist?" Barbara's mandible twitched. Stephen shifted uneasily. For the first time, Malik observed the board member's expression as doubt crept in. He was not entirely persuaded. Malik resolved to extend his efforts. "Permit me to inquire," he said, maintaining a composed demeanor. "If I was someone else, say, one of my neighbors, would we even be having this conversation?" Barbara exhibited a flare in her sinuses. Stephen opened his mouth, hesitated, and then closed it once more. There was no response. Malik folded the paper in half as he nodded. "That's what I thought." Barbara forced a tight-lipped smile as she inhaled abruptly. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA has the authority to take further action." Malik maintained an unwavering focus toward her. "Then do what you have to do." Barbara's posture was stiff with scarcely contained frustration as she turned on her heel and walked away. Stephen hesitated for a moment before proceeding. Malik observed them depart, holding the violation notice in his hand. Her deception had been exposed. However, Barbara was not the sort to concede easily. Malik anticipated that Barbara would respond in kind. He simply did not anticipate the extent to which she would push it. A hefty envelope was present in his mailbox the following morning. This time, there is no HOA logo. In contrast, it originated from a law firm. He was accused of being a fraudulent occupant in an official complaint lodged with the Davidson County Housing Authority. Barbara had transitioned from levying minor penalties to attempting to legally remove him from his own residence. Malik's pulse remained steady as he gazed at the document, but his palms tightened around the paper. She was genuinely engaged in this activity. He reviewed the complaint. The allegations were tenuous, including allegations that he had neglected to submit evidence of home ownership, suspicions that he was renting the property under false pretenses, and a claim that numerous neighbors had expressed apprehensions regarding his presence. No names are mentioned. There is no tangible evidence. Assumptions that are disguised in legalese. Malik briefly entertained the possibility of disregarding it. The allegations were unsubstantiated. However, he soon came to the realization that this was not about eviction. It was intended to cause him to become fatigued. Barbara desired for him to be mired in legal complications. She desired for him to become exhausted, frustrated, and inclined to withdraw rather than engage in combat. However, she was unaware that she was inadvertently aiding him. Malik conducted a telephone conversation that evening. "Hello, Joe," he said upon the line's reconnection. "I need a favor." Joe Martinez, Malik's real estate attorney for years, was twice as ruthless as Barbara had ever imagined, relentless, and sharp. Malik had acquired all of his necessities by the following morning. He was not merely defending himself, he was about to completely reverse the situation. The HOA emergency board meeting was overflowing with attendees 3 days later. Barbara sat at the head of the long conference table, her expression meticulously impassive. She was flanked by the other board members, some of whom appeared uneasy, while others pretended to be preoccupied with their notes. The room was alive with murmured conversations, as homeowners shifted in their seats and glanced between Malik and the board. They had all heard the rumors. They were anticipating a confrontation. Barbara lifted a printed document, clearing her throat. "We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Patterson's residence. Given the numerous violations and the concerns raised by our community members, Malik interrupted with a placid yet firm voice, stating, "I would like to speak." The lips of Barbara became thinner. "You'll have a chance to respond after." "No," Malik replied, placing a stack of his own documents on the ground. "I'm speaking now." The room was filled with a murmur. Barbara's body stiffened, but she gestured for him to continue. Malik stood, unfolding the initial document. He held up the deed to his house, stating, "This is the legal proof that I own my home. It is filed, recorded, and indisputable." A few heads were turned. A few of the board members exchanged glances. After placing the deed down, Malik extracted an additional piece of paper. "This," he emphasized, "is the purchase agreement for another property, 214 Oakwood Drive." Barbara's expression was scarcely altered, however. Malik observed the slightest hint of bewilderment in her eyes. Subsequently, he extracted the final document. "And this," he said, allowing the words to linger in the air, "is the deed for 216 Oakwood Drive. Barbara's residence." The silence that ensued was deafening. Malik did not resume his seat. He allowed Barbara to comprehend the events that had just occurred, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The same woman who had spent weeks attempting to have him removed had recently discovered that her own home belonged to him. Additionally, she was unaware. Barbara's mouth slightly opened, but no sound emanated. Subsequently, she inquired in a subdued, urgent tone, "How?" Malik's arms were folded. "You might want to check the HOA records, Barbara. That foreclosure you ignored? The property sale that went through last month? I was the buyer." The audience let out a few gasps. The documents in front of Barbara were tightly gripped by her hands. Malik inclined his head. "So tell me, Barbara, who's the real trespasser now?" Immediately, the entire chamber underwent a seismic shift. The room remained in a state of shocked silence. Barbara's face was devoid of pigment, and her demeanor, which was previously impeccably maintained, was beginning to unravel. In the presence of all, the authority she had exercised over Malik for weeks had abruptly crumbled. Malik took his time, allowing the weight of his words to settle. He had not yet completed the task. He extracted an additional document from his orderly stack. "Now, let's talk about fraudulent eviction attempts." Barbara's cranium abruptly jerked upward. "Excuse me?" Malik activated the legal complaint she had submitted. "You reported me as an illegal occupant. You claimed I had no right to live in my home." After a brief interval, he fixed his gaze on her. "Would you care to explain why?" Barbara's fingertips trembled against the table, but she endeavored to maintain a steady tone in her voice. "As I stated in my report, several residents expressed concerns," Malik interrupted. "Who?" Barbara's mandible contracted. "I am not at liberty to disclose." "No names?" Malik inquired, raising an eyebrow. "That's funny, because I spoke to several neighbors before this meeting. No one remembers expressing concerns." There were a few murmurs in the audience. Some homeowners shifted uncomfortably as they exchanged glances. The tension in the room underwent a change. Barbara and Malik were no longer the sole parties involved. It was beginning to be noted by individuals. Barbara opened her mouth, but Malik continued speaking before she could respond. "You accused me of violating HOA policies, yet you've repeatedly ignored other violations in this community." He extracted a bundle of printed emails. "I filed formal complaints about broken shutters, overgrown lawns, trash bins left out for days. None of them resulted in violation notices." He then turned his attention to the remaining members of the board. "Tell me, do these rules only apply when Barbara feels like enforcing them?" Stephen Reynolds, the vice president of the Homeowners Association, cleared his throat. "I think we should take a moment to." "No," Malik replied with a harsh tone, his gaze remaining fixed on Barbara. "Because this isn't about HOA rules. It never was. This was about her deciding who she thinks belongs here." The throng was affected by a sudden murmur. Barbara's lips parted, and a sudden wave of dread washed over her. Malik was not merely exposing her for the first time. He was compelling the entire neighborhood to observe the events that were unfolding directly in front of them. Barbara exhaled with difficulty. "Mr. Patterson, I was simply trying to," Malik concluded for her, "intimidate me into departing." "Yeah, I got that." Silence. Subsequently, a voice emanating from the rear of the room penetrated the space. "This is a disgrace," murmured an elderly man. Mr. Holloway, one of the neighborhood's most enduring residents, caught Malik's attention. He gazed at Barbara and shook his head. "You really tried to evict the man who owns your house?" The room reverberated with a few dispersed chuckles. Malik was not yet finished, despite the fact that the transition was taking place. He deposited his final document on the table. "And one more thing, Barbara, you're behind on your HOA fees." She abruptly raised her head. "That's a lie." The paper was touched by Malik. "I bought your house at auction, remember? That includes the debt attached to it. You owe the HOA over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees." The board members were inundated with a new tide of whispers. Stephen frowned as he read the document, adjusting his spectacles. "Barbara, is this true?" Barbara's lips parted, but she did not utter a word. She had concealed herself. Malik reclined in his recliner. "I suggest you start paying up. Wouldn't want to violate any of your own rules, would you?" The crowd was engulfed in a low snicker. Even a few of the board members were unable to suppress their emotions. Redness erupted on Barbara's visage. She had spent weeks attempting to exert control over Malik, and now, in the presence of the entire HOA, her authority had been rendered null and void. She clenched her mandible, desperately seeking an exit. "This meeting has been adjourned," she abruptly announced, depositing her documents into a folder. "We will revisit this matter at a later date." She immediately rose to her feet and proceeded to the exit, her heels striking against the tiled floor. However, for the first time, no one pursued her. The tension in Malik's shoulders ultimately dissipated as he exhaled. He had emerged victorious. However, Barbara was not the type to abandon her position without a fight. Barbara's face was tense with barely contained fury as she stormed out of the HOA meeting. The silence she left behind was oppressive. No one relocated. No one spoke. The board members shifted uncomfortably, as if they had finally come to the realization that they had attached themselves to the incorrect wagon. Malik also refrained from moving. He simply observed from a distance. Eventually, the murmurs began to emerge gradually. Someone murmured, "Is this true?" Another individual chuckled, "She attempted to evict the incorrect individual." Stephen Reynolds, who was still seated at the table, cleared his throat. "Well," he began, awkwardly adjusting his tie, "I believe it is safe to say that this situation was mishandled." "Mishandled?" Malik exclaimed with a brief chuckle. "That's one way to put it." Lisa Hendricks, a middle-aged woman who resided 3 houses away, approached him. She acknowledged, "I am uncertain about what to say. I had no idea she was doing all this." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you?" Lisa's mouth was agape, but she was unable to voice any words. Shifting in their seats, a few others looked away. Due to the fact that they were aware. Barbara had issued violation after violation as they observed. They had observed how she singled out Malik. However, no one had spoken until she embarrassed herself. The remorse was now beginning to sink in. However, remorse did not constitute an apology. Malik was not interested in empty platitudes. Instead, he addressed Stephen. "Since we're still here, let's discuss actual HOA violations." Stephen sat up, feeling uneasy. "Like what?" Malik retrieved his manifest, which Barbara had rejected when he submitted it several weeks prior. "Broken fences. Trash bins left out for days. Lawns that haven't been mowed in weeks. All of these violations exist right now, but somehow, I was the only one receiving fines." Stephen briefly examined the list before turning his attention to the other board members. A few of them appeared visibly uneasy. They were aware that Malik was correct. Stephen stated, "We will conduct a thorough review of these complaints." Malik emitted a gradual assent. "Good. And while you're at it, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Barbara Whitman for harassment, falsifying HOA complaints, and attempting to misuse her authority." A new wave of murmurs coursed through the chamber. Lisa shifted in her position. "Do we have the authority to do that?" Stephen exhaled slowly. "The board can vote for removal if a HOA officer is found abusing their position." Malik lunged forward. "Then put it to a vote." Lisa hesitated before nodding. "Seconded." Hands began to rise in succession throughout the room. Malik observed as the individuals who had previously remained mute voted to deprive Barbara of her title. It was absurd. She would remain the president of the HOA if she had simply disregarded him. However, Her own arrogance had been the cause of her downfall. Stephen cleared his throat a few minutes later. By majority vote, Barbara Whitman is officially removed as president of the Brentwood Estates HOA, effective immediately. There it was, the final nail in the coffin. Malik stood and deposited his documents into his folder. "Well," he said, turning toward the door, "that was productive." He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him as he stepped out, and a few murmurs broke the tension. That evening, they had all acquired a valuable lesson. However, the individual who required it the most was still in denial. Barbara Whitman was not yet finished. Barbara Whitman did not tolerate defeat. Malik observed her standing at the edge of his driveway the morning following her public humiliation at the HOA meeting. This time, she was not alone. Standing beside her was her husband, Richard, who was in his early 70s and possessed a scowl and a rigid posture. Malik crossed his arms as he entered his veranda. "Something I can help you with?" Barbara's intonation was tightly controlled. "I want to discuss the sale of my home." Malik had anticipated this outcome. Ultimately, the prospect of renting from him must have been intolerable for her. "I am not selling," he stated uncomplicatedly. Barbara's mandible was clenched. "I've lived in that house for 32 years. Malik inclined his head. "And yet you never paid off the debt attached to it." Richard cleared his throat. "We're prepared to offer you a fair price." Malik's body was inclined toward the railing. "Define fair." Barbara grumbled, her patience fraying. "The same amount you paid at auction." Malik's laughter was brief. "That's not how real estate works. You lost your house because of unpaid fees. I legally purchased it. If you want it back, you'll have to buy it at market value." Barbara's palms were clenched into fists. "That's ridiculous. You're just trying to make a profit off of me." The look on Malik's face became increasingly stern. "No, Barbara. I'm treating you exactly how you treated me." There was an extended period of silence between them. She had been persuaded that she possessed all the power, and for weeks, she had weaponized rules and regulations against him. Right now, she was the one who was at the mercy of another individual. Richard exhaled. "How much?" Malik's eyes were directed toward the residence. "Given the location, the current market, and your unpaid fees, $450,000. Barbara's expression became contorted. "That's outrageous." Malik shook his head. "Then I guess you'll have to find somewhere else to live." True panic appeared on her features for the first time. Presently, this was reality. She was not merely being removed from the HOA board, she was also losing the residence in which she had resided for 3 decades. Richard heaved deeply and rubbed his face with his hand. "We'll consider it," Malik acknowledged. "Take your time." Barbara hesitated as they prepared to depart. She returned his gaze, her countenance altered. Not quite regret, but the discovery that she had never been in control. She had been so consumed with the task of expelling him that she had failed to recognize the genuine threat. Her own actions had resulted in her complete ruin. Malik waited for the moment to pass before speaking. "Barbara." She jerked her head. "The next time you make a judgment about someone without knowing them," he said, gesturing toward her residence, "remember the consequences." She did not utter a single syllable. He abruptly turned and departed. The for sale sign was erected in front of 216 Oakwood Drive 1 month later. Barbara had declined to purchase the house at Malik's price, and no bank would provide her with a loan for the required amount. In the middle of the night, she and Richard packed up and relocated to a smaller residence located across town. The neighborhood underwent a transformation subsequent to that. The HOA began functioning as intended without Barbara in command, focusing on genuine concerns rather than enforcing frivolous rules. Additionally, what about the neighbors? Some individuals continued to avoid eye contact, as they were embarrassed by their reticence. However, others made an effort to gradually dismantle the barricade that they had assisted Barbara in constructing. Lisa Hendricks, one of the few individuals who had voted against Barbara, arrived at Malik's driveway one day with a platter of cookies. "I am aware that it is late," she said, shifting awkwardly, "but I would like to extend a warm welcome to the neighborhood." Malik smiled as he accepted the platter. "Took you long enough," Lisa chuckled, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Yeah. It did." Malik nibbled on a biscuit. "Delightful. A little stale. However, it is preferable to be late than never." Certain individuals dedicate their lives to exerting control over others. They believe that their authority is derived from their status, from the laws, or from the ability to make others feel inferior. However, what constitutes genuine power? That is the result of being aware of one's identity and refusing to allow anyone to diminish it. Subscribing to this narrative will provide you with additional content. because I am confident that there are numerous additional sources from which this information originated.